It's a big surprise. Nobody thought the ocean was this deep. So all of a sudden we've got scientists saying, why is that?
Space is vast and hollow, yet beneath the surface of our own oceans, there exists an energy so raw and so misunderstood that it keeps the world's top researchers awake at night. A deep-sea probe deployed near the Puerto Rico Trench recently captured a thermal reading that has no business existing under any framework of science we currently accept. Is it a small fissure? Is it something far larger? What kind of geological feature could possibly produce a signature like that? One extraordinary data point opens the door to 1,000 questions that nobody seems willing to answer out loud. In a fraction of a second, the recorded temperature leapt from near freezing to boiling point. This was not the work of a volcanic vent. It was a contained, localized burst of thermal energy.
A little hole? Is it a big hole? What kind of feature is it down there? There's a whole lot of questions you get when you find this one spectacular reading.
Something down there is producing power at a scale we cannot account for. The ocean floor is not the silent graveyard we have always assumed it to be. It is an active hunting ground. And we are only beginning to understand that whatever inhabits it has already taken notice of us, something capable of bending immense energy to its will. Sound travels 5 times faster through water than it does through open air. That single fact transforms the ocean into one of the most efficient acoustic environments on the entire planet. When the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration first activated its deep-sea hydrophone array, the expectation was straightforward. Scientists anticipated hearing the background noise of a living planet, the groan of shifting tectonic plates, the crack of calving icebergs, perhaps the distant mechanical hum of a supertanker engine cutting across the surface far above. What they recorded instead was something that looked nothing like natural interference. The frequency profiles were structured. They were consistent, rhythmic, and they originated from the Hadal Zone, the deepest reaches of the ocean trenches, a place where life is supposed to be sparse and the water is supposed to be silent. The most well-known of these recordings, a sound that researchers nicknamed the bloop, was eventually attributed to a fracturing ice shelf, a seismic event, rather than a biological one. However, newer recordings pulled from the Mariana Trench tell a more complicated story. These acoustic signatures, sometimes called the metallic train by the researchers who study them, sound like something enormous and heavy being dragged slowly across the seabed. They persist for minutes at a time without fading. The problem with attributing them to geology is simple. A geological event produces a sharp crack followed by a rumble that dissipates as the energy bleeds away. A continuous, rhythmic dragging sound requires a sustained source of energy behind it. It implies something with direction. It implies agency. The volume of these sounds is where the real problem begins. To generate an acoustic event loud enough to be detected across the full width of the Pacific Ocean, as some of these anomalies have been, the source must be releasing energy that dwarfs a nuclear submarine's active sonar ping. If a living creature is responsible for producing sounds at that scale, it would need to be significantly larger than a blue whale. But here is where the biology becomes a wall. Deep ocean creatures should not possess air-filled internal chambers, the kind of structure that most marine animals use to produce sound. At a depth of 11,000 meters, any pocket of air would be obliterated by the surrounding pressure in an instant. So whatever is generating these sounds is doing it through a mechanism that science has not yet described, perhaps by grinding massive stridulating organs against one another, or by vibrating fluid-filled chambers held under extraordinary internal tension. There have been attempts within the scientific community to filter these sounds out of public data releases, labeling them as sensor malfunction or background tectonic interference. But the raw data before it gets cleaned up tells a completely different story. The intervals between these sounds are far too regular. Nature almost never operates in perfect 4-minute cycles. The implication that no one wants to say directly is that whatever is down there is enormous, active, and loud enough to shake a column of water for miles in every direction. The pressure at that depth exceeds 8 tons per square inch. To survive there, a creature would need to be composed almost entirely of water, or built from something denser and harder than bone. The idea that something is moving through that environment, generating sounds comparable to a jet engine, dismantles our assumptions about what the deep ocean is capable of concealing. Everyone fixates on the idea of a surviving megalodon, But the acoustic data points to something far stranger than a large shark. A shark does not make a metallic grinding sound against the seabed. These recordings suggest something armored, something with mass, and something that has no interest in moving quietly. When you examine the biology of the deep ocean with any seriousness, the numbers begin to break apart. Life runs on proteins. These are complex, tightly folded molecular structures that perform virtually every function inside a living organism. Under the pressure that exists at 11,000 meters, proteins should not be able to hold their structure. They should unfold and collapse, causing the organism's cells to fail at a fundamental level. It is the equivalent of trying to stack a house of cards inside a hydraulic press. And yet we have the snailfish. This translucent, ghost-like creature currently holds the verified record for the deepest living fish ever found, observed moving casually at depths exceeding 8,000 meters. It looks almost impossibly delicate, like a tadpole assembled from wet tissue paper. But its very existence is a scientific miracle that demands an explanation. The explanation, as far as we currently understand it, involves a compound called trimethylamine N-oxide, or TMAO. This molecule acts as a structural brace for proteins, counteracting the crushing force of the surrounding water and preventing molecular collapse. The deeper a fish lives, the greater its concentration of TMAO must be. This compound also happens to produce that sharp, distinct fishy smell most people associate with seafood. But there is a ceiling on how far this adaptation can be pushed. Scientific modeling shows that at approximately 8,200 meters, the concentration of TMAO required to keep protein stable becomes toxic to the organism itself. The fish would accumulate so much of this compound that osmosis would reverse direction, flooding its cells with water and causing them to burst from the inside. According to every biological model currently in use, fish simply cannot survive below this threshold. It is a hard wall drawn by chemistry. And yet, during a descent into the Serena Deep, camera footage captured the unmistakable silhouette of a creature swimming well below that theoretical limit. Something large, something clearly mobile, existing in a zone where our best science says it cannot. The implication is that life down there has developed a completely different biochemical framework, one that does not rely on TMAO and that we have not yet identified. Some researchers quietly speculate about silicon-based structures or ultra-dense, lipid compounds that behave less like biological tissue and more like solid plastic. We may be looking at an entirely alien form of biology that happens to be living on the same planet as us. Then there is the phenomenon known as deep-sea gigantism. In the extreme cold and crushing pressure of the Hadal Zone, invertebrate life tends to grow to proportions that seem pulled from a nightmare. Amphipods, creatures that are essentially oversized sea fleas, have been recovered at lengths exceeding a foot. Picture a flea the size of a domestic cat, armored and swarming in absolute darkness. These things strip a carcass down to bare bone in hours. But here is the point that gets overlooked. In every ecosystem ever studied, behind every population of scavengers, there is a predator. The presence of foot-long, armored shrimp moving through the Hadal zones implies the existence of something large enough, strong enough, and aggressive enough to hunt them. You do not get enormous herds of prey animals without something sitting at the top of that food chain. In the deep trenches, the prey is giant worms and armored crustaceans. The predators, we have not found them yet, but the math demands they exist, and that they are enormous. The most disturbing piece of this biological puzzle is not the creatures we have managed to observe, it is the energy required to sustain them. Food in the deep ocean is desperately scarce. Marine snow, the slow drift of dead plankton and organic waste falling from the surface layers, simply does not provide enough caloric input to support a significant population of large animals. This means there is a food source we have not yet identified. One possibility is that there are large predatory organisms that enter a state of extended dormancy for years or even decades, becoming active only when a whale fall event drops a massive sudden supply of nutrition to the seafloor. Another possibility is that something down there is extracting energy directly from the chemical processes of the Earth itself in ways that have no parallel in known biology. The silence from the broader scientific community on the subject of this food chain gap is itself revealing. The researchers who study this know the numbers do not balance. There is too much life relative to the available food, which means something is eating something else that we have not found yet. The floor these creatures move across is far from stable ground. The popular image of the trench bottom as a cold, featureless plain of mud is wildly inaccurate. The Hagel zone sits at the collision points of tectonic plates, where the Earth's crust is actively being pulled down and recycled into the mantle below. This process releases staggering amounts of thermal and chemical energy. Consider the Daikoku Seamount, located in the arc of submarine volcanoes near the Mariana System. This structure features an open pool of molten sulfur on the seafloor, not superheated water, actual liquid sulfur, glowing with a violet light that belongs in a science fiction film, sitting beneath thousands of feet of ocean water. The surrounding seawater does not simply boil and cool it down. The pressure at that depth functions like the sealed lid of an industrial pressure cooker, allowing water to reach temperatures near 700 degrees Fahrenheit without converting to steam. This superheated, mineral-rich fluid erupts from hydrothermal vents and instantly precipitates into towering mineral chimneys upon contact with the cold surrounding water. The unpredictability of this environment is the part that should concern anyone attempting to explore it. Sensors placed near active vent systems regularly record sudden, massive thermal excursions, spikes in temperature that spread across a wide area without warning, as though a section of the seafloor has momentarily opened up. A submersible caught inside one of these invisible plumes would not simply be crushed by pressure. It would be boiled alive in seconds. Most people also do not realize that these vents are typically surrounded by dense colonies of tube worms and blind crabs that thrive on the toxic chemistry the vents produce. But geological records show that entire colonies are regularly wiped out overnight. One survey shows a thriving community. The next reveals a barren, scout area, where something either released a violent burst of energy or triggered a massive sediment displacement that erased everything in its path. The Puerto Rico Trench adds another layer to this already complicated picture. The gravitational field in that region is measurably weaker than in the surrounding ocean because the crust beneath it is so thin and the trench is so deep. Beneath that thin crust, however, dense pockets of mantle material pull on sensors in ways that suggest pieces of the upper mantle are breaking off and sinking under their own weight, a process that could trigger a major tsunami with essentially no warning whatsoever. NASA has mapped these gravitational anomalies from orbit, and they appear on the data like deep bruises pressed into the surface of the planet. The seafloor itself is also subject to events called megaturbidites, which are effectively underwater avalanches of liquefied mud that move cubic miles of material at speeds comparable to highway traffic. These are not gradual geological processes. They are sudden, catastrophic displacements that bury everything in their path in moments. The fiber optic cables that carry the majority of global internet traffic across the ocean floor are regularly severed by these events. When oceanographers review the data following one of these incidents, there is little to say publicly because there is nothing anyone can do to prevent or predict them. They serve as reminders that on geological timescales, the solid Earth behaves like a fluid, and the bottom of the ocean is its most volatile expression. This is where the story shifts away from passive environmental observation into something more direct, because we can rationalize acoustic anomalies as geological events, and we can explain thermal spikes as vent activity. What we cannot easily explain away is physical damage to our own equipment. Deep-sea landers are not fragile instruments. They are constructed from grade 5 titanium alloy and syntactic foam, engineered to resist the full crushing weight of the water column above them. When they are recovered after a deployment, they should carry nothing more than a layer of sediment and biological film. But landers recovered from the Kermadec and Mariana trenches have come back bearing deep, parallel gouges running along their sides. Titanium is among the hardest metals used in any engineering application. To produce a visible scratch in it requires an object of comparable or greater hardness, applied with significant force. Sediment cannot scratch titanium. Snailfish cannot scratch titanium. Something in that environment is hard enough and powerful enough to damage the toughest equipment we can build. The marks frequently have the character of a glancing blow, rather than a direct impact, producing smooth, continuous lines rather than jagged, irregular dents. That profile is consistent with something large making deliberate contact, perhaps investigating an unfamiliar object in its territory, and the force of that contact was sufficient to compromise the hull integrity of a titanium structure. Then there are the missing bait cages. Standard practice during deep-sea lander deployments involves attaching a steel cage loaded with oily fish to attract amphipods for study. On multiple occasions, landers have returned with the attachment arm bent or completely snapped off, and the cage gone entirely. A steel cable engineered to withstand thousands of pounds of tension does not simply fail on its own. There are no currents at that depth capable of generating the force required to break it. The only logical conclusion available is that something grabbed the cage and pulled against the cable until it gave way. The question of what species would interact with a steel cage in that manner, and more precisely what is physically capable of generating the tension required to snap it, remains officially unanswered. The most chilling physical evidence of all may be found on the seafloor itself. High-resolution sonar mapping of trench floors has revealed long, meandering furrows pressed into the sediment. These are not the tiny burrows left by worms or small invertebrates. These are channels roughly 3 feet across and extending for miles across the bottom. They look as though something enormous and heavy was dragged across the surface of the world at its deepest point. Some scientists have argued for geological slumping as the cause, but slumping follows gravity and moves downhill. These tracks meander, they curve, they reverse direction and loop back on themselves. They exhibit the hallmarks of directed movement. A geological process does not change its mind and turn left. If these are the movement trails of a living organism, it would need to be a bottom-dwelling creature of extraordinary size, likely something soft-bodied that does not register well on sonar, dragging itself through the nutrient-rich ooze in search of food. The picture of a creature 100 feet long or a massive, flat-bodied scavenger moving methodically through the Hadal Zone is scientifically consistent with what the track data actually shows, even if it sounds like something written for a horror screenplay. The refusal of major oceanographic institutions to offer any comment on the non-geological nature of these striations is the loudest signal in this entire story. The three-dimensional maps exist. The sonar data is detailed and clean. The trails are visible. But formally acknowledging that something large and directional is moving around at 36,000 feet requires rewriting decades of established scientific understanding, and the institutions responsible for maintaining that understanding are not prepared to absorb that kind of disruption. They choose silence because silence is safer than a paradigm shift. The question of why we know more about the cratered surface of Mars than we do about the bottom of our own ocean gets asked a great deal, usually in introductory oceanography classes or at dinner parties, and it always receives the same comfortable answer. The logistics are difficult. Space is a vacuum, and radiation travels through it freely. Water is dense and blocks radio signals almost entirely. Building a vessel capable of surviving 8 tons of pressure per square inch is an engineering challenge of a different order than building one capable of surviving the vacuum of space. These are all accurate statements. They are the facts that allow the conversation to end politely and everyone to go home reassured. But they are not the whole truth. The real reason less than 20% of the ocean floor has been mapped in any detail is not purely a matter of engineering difficulty. It is that the data being recovered is deeply and repeatedly inconsistent with the models we use to understand how life and geology are supposed to behave, and the scientific establishment does not have a clean framework for handling that inconsistency. There is a persistent public belief that science is a fearless, self-correcting machine that accelerates toward new discoveries with enthusiasm. People assume that a researcher who found evidence of something genuinely impossible, a biological organism that should not exist, a geological formation with no known mechanism, would sprint toward publication and the recognition that comes with it. The lived reality of academic science is far more conservative than that image allows for. The thing researchers fear most is not the unknown. It is being wrong in public. It is publishing something that cannot be replicated or explained within the existing framework. In the scientific community, you do not submit a paper that reads something massive and unidentified, scratched my titanium robot. You submit data. You submit repeatable, verifiable models with error margins and control conditions. And when the data arrives making no sense at all, when the biology implies metabolic rates that violate thermodynamics, when the acoustic signatures carry a rhythm that looks artificial, and when the geology of the trench floor looks less like natural erosion and more like deliberate excavation. You do not publish. You file it under instrument error. You label it sensor drift. You call it an anomaly and move on to the next deployment. The genuine terror in all of this is not a monster. It is the gap in our map of reality. We have constructed a model of the Earth that treats the deep ocean as an extension of everything above it, a gradient where conditions simply become more extreme as depth increases, colder, darker, more compressed, but fundamentally the same world following the same rules. That assumption is wrong. The Hadal Zone below 6,000 meters is not just a more intense version of the shallow ocean. It is a separate world operating under conditions that may require a completely different scientific vocabulary to describe. The biology we observe there should not exist by any model we currently accept. We find gigantism in an environment with insufficient food to support it. We find organisms that appear to operate on metabolic timescales, suggesting they have been alive since before the last ice age. We find creatures moving below the physical threshold at which life is supposed to be possible. More disturbing than any of the biology, however, is the nature of our own presence there. We frame our exploration of the deep ocean as passive observation. We describe ourselves as investigators, careful and non-invasive, watching from a distance the way a naturalist watches birds in a forest. This framing is dangerously flattering to ourselves. We are not bird watchers in a forest. We are intruders crashing into an ecosystem that has existed in complete, undisturbed stillness for tens of millions of years. The creatures that evolved in that environment did so in a world of absolute darkness and near total silence, developing senses of extraordinary delicacy, tuned to the faint pressure waves and trace chemical signatures that constitute communication and navigation at that depth. And then we arrive. We drop large, loud titanium structures into their environment from above. The thrusters on our remotely operated vehicles produce cavitation noise that, in the density of seawater, propagates outward like a shockwave for miles in every direction. Our high-intensity LED and halogen lighting systems blast through an ecosystem that has never in its entire evolutionary history been exposed to artificial light, potentially blinding photosensitive organisms permanently with a single deployment. We are not conducting quiet observations. We are dropping a carnival into a space that has functioned as a cathedral of silence for geological epochs. We are reaching into a pitch-black room, poking at something large and unknown, and then expressing surprise when something pushes back. The events recorded at the bottom of Challenger Deep and other trench systems are not random instrument failures. When you go through the raw operational logs rather than the sanitized summary reports, prepared for public release, a pattern becomes visible. It is a pattern of response that escalates in proportion to our intrusion. Think about the mechanical failures that have plagued deep-sea expeditions for years. A tether cable reinforced with Kevlar and steel braid, rated to absorb 10,000 pounds of tension, does not snap by accident. Physics is clear on this point. The cable must be pulled, and pulled with a force that exceeds its design limit. Yet research vehicles go dark regularly in the deep trenches. When the tethers are recovered, the ends show fraying consistent, not with a clean cut against a sharp edge, but with tension and torsion, the signature of something that grabbed the machine and pulled in the opposite direction. When equipment is recovered at all, the physical evidence on the frames and housings tells a story that the official reports prefer to translate into the language of equipment: malfunction, deep gouges in syntactic foam buoyancy blocks, a material so dense that striking it with a sledgehammer produces no visible mark, scratches on camera housings that carry the geometry of raking contact with something hard and large, not the random abrasion of sediment impact. The ocean floor is the last genuine mystery remaining on this planet. The evidence accumulating from decades of deep-sea exploration consistently suggests that we share this world with organisms and phenomena that we are not ready to formally acknowledge. The scratches on our landers did not come from rocks. The missing cages did not float away. The sounds in the trenches do not come from ice. And the tracks on the seafloor were not made by slumping sediment. The question of what is actually down there remains open, officially unanswered, and carefully kept that way. The silence is not ignorance. It is a choice. And the thing about that kind of deliberate silence is that it tells you more than any published paper ever could.